If there are solutions to be found, the tool we must use is the double-pronged devices of compassion and empathy. A dual-wielded tool that we have long neglected as a species, and that most of us probably have no recollection of how to use.
This is the Almost Daily Zencast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
Greetings, namaste, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and good night to you. Thank you for tuning in from around the world to listen to this humble, real, raw, radically unscripted audio blog, talk show style podcast entertainment show with some probative pseudo-philosophical questions worth contemplating, at least in my humble opinion. So I had a moment today out in the world, like outside, interacting with real people. And I was busy contemplating an alarming and trending bit of what I have come to the conclusion of assessing it to be like us versus them dehumanizing neurolinguistic conditioning. But these two things sort of sit juxtaposed in my mind as I come to you today for this episode, and I struggle through my hiccup-caused burpee hiccups. My coffee-caused burpee hiccups. My hiccup-infused coffee burps. There we go. That one was better. My coffee-infused hiccup burps. I was out and about in the world, right? And you ever walk into one of those conversations that just begs you to then say the thing that you know you were brought into the room, into this circumstance, into this conversational equation to contribute because no one else involved was likely to have said it. Two service industry acquaintances of mine who were quite enthusiastically engaged in their own semi-private but also semi-public, and I use the word with respect, amateur, pseudo-philosophical exploration of current event issues. And they were coming to an agreement about a sort of critical juncture, a critical central elemental piece of whatever got them there conversationally. They were hitting upon something that they were like, yep, despite coming from, slightly different ends of or portions of the spectrum of potential socioeconomical, political, ideological constructs, and yet probably not being that dissimilar. These two gentlemen being of approximate, same age and demographic context, from my limited understanding. I'm not particularly close with them, but these are two individuals out in the real world commercial landscape that I will stop to have lots of extended friendly chit-chat, depending on circumstances and how many people in line may get annoyed with me. And but with whom I have not pushed the envelope of my own personal eccentricities of thought, right? Like, they already know that I'm not exactly on the exact same page that either of them might consider themselves being on. And odds are, although I don't know for certain, that the two of them don't consider themselves to be sitting on the same page per se. I would imagine. I speculate there. But they both agreed on something that I think is really critical, and thus sort of inspired what I wanted to talk about today. Empathy and or compassion. I consider them like the caduceus. Is that the name? Is that how you pronounce it? The caduceus, the divine instrument held by Raphael, if I'm not mistaken. One of the four cardinal archdukes, or whatever their title is of heaven, four cardinal archangels. Yes, it's a double spiraled or a double helix spiral. Like a dual-wielding, dual-pronged, metaphysical, psychokinetically spiritual tool. One that arguably has been sitting on a very tall shelf, at the very back of the shelf, gathering dust, not quite within reach of your average human everyday psyche. Although we all pay lip service to compassion, some of the harder work that the human species is called to conduct requires that, like expert ninja level skills of proficiency wielding this tool. And it's quite clear. The evidence is overwhelmingly surrounding us that whatever is going on, embedded in our psychological, everyday, mundane normalcy norms, our status quo collection of ideological dogmas, it isn't one monolithic thing, because it changes and adjusts and shifts by community, by geography, by social identity, etc., etc. But broadly speaking, it can be assessed clearly through observation of living history, living memory of the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years, that it is reasonable to suggest that some entities, some endeavors, some quadrants of power, let us call them, to coin a term, have a vested interest in propagating and manifesting as high a density of sort of anti-empathy as possible per capita in the human species. Now, why would this be? That's a really big thing I just said. But, I mean, ranging from the more obvious us versus them ideological constructs, not the least of which is this spiritual malarkey I see that has been trending more and more in the last 15, 20 years in self-identified, self-proclaimed New Age spiritual communities. And I don't use any of that labeling in a negative or judgmental way. I'm just addressing communities of people using the terminology they have appropriated for themselves. Just like when I use the term conspiracy theorist, I'm not trying to spit in someone's face. I'm not trying to belittle them. I'm not using that in a pejorative fashion. I'm literally trying to address any and all individuals engaged in public discourse that self-identify. And it's a curious thing, to go on a quick sidebar, that they love to, that community as a broad spectrum of very different-minded folks generally, knee-jerkedly, loves to complain about being dismissed as conspiracy theorists because they long ago, adopted the mantra that the terminology was invented as a gatekeeping psychological dismissal terminology. And while that may be very true, friends, they've also, as a community, semi-unconsciously or very consciously or very unconsciously, as I'm sure it occurs at all levels of that mini spectrum of awareness, they've either self-awaredly or unself-awaredly adopted it for themselves to a certain degree, normalized calling themselves and each other and their conferences and the content that they share conspiracy theory. So I think it's fair, if I may, to say the conspiracy theory and then express concerns, observations, etc., and not be accused of blindly, dismissively, axiomatically being judgmental of the community and everyone in it. I'm just suggesting there is a community. I'm just utilizing the language that community uses to identify themselves in order to engage in a discussion about different perspectives and that may or may not be congruent with that. Anyways, I digress. Good grief. What were we talking about? Compassion. The lack thereof is something that it appears a lot of this content, which is why I take issue with it, right, is riddled with the kind of programming that perpetuates or engenders or plants the seeds of that kind of dissociative thinking and behavioral patterning. In other words, there seems to be some collection of interests, whether they're all a big, broad, organized, evil, part of the cabal, as it were, as some people would reference it, or whether this is just something that human beings have picked up as broad, general, tribalistic, tactical tools to use on each other, and therefore they are common, without the need for any kind of centralized evil monolith of evil. As I find it's very difficult to buy into monolithic proposals, but that's a whole other issue. Pin on the corkboard, we've discussed it before. There does seem to be content. Let's leave it at that. Let's not even try to address where it comes from. At least not yet. Pin on the corkboard, I have discussed that before, and my controversial conspiracy theory about content that is labeled conspiracy theory content. Not in a dismissive way, but this is what it calls itself kind of way. There are patterns, friends, and it's funny how the people who are in that community, who want to be busy promoting and sharing and debating in favor of and getting people to agree to a broad cornucopia of this massive spectrum of endlessly perpetuated, recycled, repackaged, goalpost moved content. They don't want to acknowledge or look at some of the inherent flaws. But back to this conversation that I found myself discussing or walking into. I had to pay for my coffee. I had to, step up and punch in my sip and save code. And, we got to use, they are by protocol encouraged to tell everyone to use the automated system, the AI-driven automated checkout system. And there's in-house joking that pre-exists here, and I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but I certainly have made the joke out of my own thinking it up, that it's like they're training the machine And their job has literally, to a certain extent, been scaled back. They're encouraged to manage the flow of clientele at the automated system, and they go way out of their way to cater to and assist those using the quote-unquote automated system, as it often encounters errors, mistakes, hiccups, and weird, it doesn't do things right, it doesn't scan things right, etc. It works well enough. But this affords these two young fellas the freedom to discuss quite vigorously whatever they get into discussing with each other, because they basically, until the line gets X many people long, I imagine they must have some sort of rules about it. I'm speculating here, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions or badmouth anything. They avoid taking register action, and then they'll go and help one or two people at one of the registers, but still navigate and help people at one of the things. So they were caught up in this discussion, and they were confirming the simple reality that when an event, when a reality, when a fact is obscured from someone's personal field of experience, and I'm putting what they were saying into my own words, mind you, for the record, then it's difficult to relate to people who understand this phenomena, right? When someone has not experienced a phenomena, let us say someone has never been a fan of sports, it's difficult for them to relate to sports enthusiasts who are quite fanatical about a particular team, right? And without implementing, and I chose that example because it's politically neutral, but we'll extrapolate out into politics in a hot second, right? I can relate to this in particular because I have both been a sports fan in training and also adamantly disinterested, completely at one point in my life, a kind of sports, anti-sports person where it would just sort of nauseate me a bit, and it would annoy me when people insisted, especially strangers, who were imposing on my otherwise sports-free personal space in public settings, like sitting at a bar or at a restaurant, or whatever, in some sort of collective environment where conversation tends to crop up. It's now without any sort of malicious endeavors to articulate, manipulation in the population. It's already devilishly easy for human beings to go through life without habituated, empathetic connecting with others, right? Like it's a pit trap. It's an ego trap we can all fall into. If you were to hypothetically, I'm just pointing this out because it's a reality in nature, in observable reality, in a world without conspiracy theory content and its hypothetical postulates, you would still see that people would run around in whatever society we had created in that perfect paradigm, choosing to operate, either consciously or unconsciously, with very little or a complete and total lack of compassion and or empathy. Conversely, you would also see people who go out of their way to exercise those muscles, to wield that two-handed tool. And I'm making an analogy because I'm drawn to the caduceus. It's a mysterious image, which has been conflated with negative, malicious, evil agenda issues in conspiracy theory content, in the spectrum of conspiracy theory content, but is not universally ubiquitous in it. So to many, it may be an alien or unknown word. But it also has an origin reaching way further back than any of this postmodern, attempt to recontextualize things. which is one of the things that really concerns me. To go back to the context in which I walked into this discussion, and that I had to say the thing that I had to say, which is I'm trying to like re-trigger in my mind. I had spent a few moments earlier this morning responding to a set of memes, which I've seen before, or very similar ones like it, claiming the following to be a fact, which I, in my humble opinion, find zero evidence for, and absolutely find it too easy to debunk through, my own lived experience. And that I, after many years of contemplating it, questioning it, and, doing my amateur analysis, find impossible to believe. But this claim that there are quote unquote non-player characters, human-like entities that exist in the world that, according to the meme I saw this morning, severely outnumber us, like 50,000 to 1. Us, because the readership of this meme is included inherently by the way that the grammar and the structure of the language in this meme works and is fashioned to work. That, we are the special real people, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, dear reader, but most everyone else out there is fake, as in not actually human, as in they don't have a soul, as in they're not you, they're not as special as you, and they're not worthy of the same mutual respect, human rights, etc., etc., etc. Now, the problem I find with this, and I see that it's quite popular and has been growing and making, various rounds of trending over the last 25 years, this concept. And it probably goes back. I haven't pushed to dig too hard on it specifically to see if there's any root origin being extrapolated and or recontextualized and or misused in ancient culture or ancient spiritual texts or traditions of any kind. But based on my own broad spectrum self-education, and I am an admitted amateur autodidact. Whatever I know, I taught myself, right? By examining sources and then, trying to reach further back through whatever sources they indicate, etc. And I don't think that just watching YouTube videos should be counted as research. I use that pin on the corkboard where we talked about that. Don't want to go spiraling out of control on a rant about that on this episode. I digress. I was questioning not only that content once again, having seen this for, on and off for years, making the rounds amongst, self-identified, non-religious, spiritual people. There is totally a Christian pseudo-theological equivalent idea, which is the vilification, like the demonization of others. Any sort of affiliation with demonic entities, being possessed by them, being a spawn of them, etc. You are, when you buy into such ideological dogma, you are inherently casting judgment on the targeted others, whether there's an explicit target or not. The way this neurolinguistic programming works is you eventually, at some point, get handed a target list after having been conditioned by this kind of thinking that X group of people have no soul because either they are demons from the pits of hell in some sort of, it's a war between heaven and hell, pseudo-Christian ideology. Nowhere does Jesus ever talk about anything like that, by the way. In fact, the most wild and radical thing that Jesus does talk about that Christians spend a great deal of time radically ignoring is the opening of the third eye so that the body can be transmuted into that of pure light. Pin on the corkboard. We've discussed it in sidebars of many episodes, and I believe we've even done a special episode or two about it in the past. So dig around, look for that. Any kind of, here's my broad picture thing, right? Okay, let's get to a point. Oh, DJ Z is like, you haven't played any music, you crazy person. He's absolutely right. Let's pause here and cleanse the palate and play a little bit of the newest album, The Future. This is a mislabel, or are there two albums, DJ Z? Because this says The Future Is Now, and I thought the new album was called The Future Was Yesterday. This is a different album. Okay. From The Future Is Now, Recursive Rhythms Dancing. Please enjoy. What does it mean to empathize and have compassion for others? Because there's a lot of shallow lip service talk about it in our world and in our culture. But like I was saying, there's also clearly a lot of effort put into trying to engineer a growing absence of empathy in our cultural dynamics. I would argue it is a powerful and dangerous tool, to combine the conditioning of the hypernormalization of an absence of empathy in the self for others, right? In other words, to normalize in our society not giving a flying fart in high wind about anyone but oneself. Oh, geez, yeah, that's not new or anything. Materialist egoism and self-aggrandizing, self-superialism is baked into the cake already. But to combine that with an absolute lack of willingness to even explore the notion of empathy and compassion, and those aren't just abstract ideas, right? Those are psychological, metaphysical, energetic, spiritual actions and or, aka tools that are used to conduct spiritual work, emotional work that is very difficult to describe, but can be summarized eloquently as opening up oneself enough to receive others as they are, and with the recognition of a mutual, self-sameness, right? That no matter how different we are also metaphysically one and the same, or at least can relate to each other as if we were. Now, pin on the corkboard, we did a whole special episode at some point. I believe, forgive me if I'm mistaken, I believe it's part of the unauthorized and explicit readings special segment of the show, but it might not be. But we did a whole special segment about Lars Moll? His name is one of those names that messes with my triggers my dyslexia and gets flippity flopped. But I think it's Lars Moll wrote an eloquent, beautiful, an extremely potent very slim, very tiny, very approachable, very, very powerful book to read, entitled, and I have it right the F here. Why am I struggling with any of this? The Law of Light. And there's a lot that could be said about this book, not the least of which is that he begins the entire exploration with the foundation of the original teachings of Jesus as captured in their original language of Jesus, Aramaic, right? Like going back before the Latinification of any of the biblical texts, back before the texts were messed with and reorganized and edited and omitted, and some of which were banned, etc. And he explores the original parchment source material, the original ancient source material texts in their original languages, most of which are, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in Aramaic, and drills down deep into the nuance of the language and how to cleanly, clearly, accurately, academically translate that into English, and contrasts that with, allows the reader, without really trying, without any kind of heavy-handed leading thing, allows the reader to compare that to how postmodern Christianity often interprets it. And there's a profound realization there that the golden rule, the golden law, as it is worded in the Bible, is so shallow. Treat others as if you would like to be treated yourself is lovely and on the right path, facing the right direction. But if you knew what the original Aramaic said, you'd realize what a watered down, shallow, and inherently less informative statement it was, it became in its reformulation, which of course took many generations of editing, I'm sure, and it wasn't done in one fell swoop or in one particular instance. I don't know the exact details of that, but going back to what I wish I had the page in front of me. I don't want to get sidetracked. But in the original Aramaic phraseology, as translated directly into English, that divine teaching, wisdom teaching, guides humanity to look upon all other members of humanity as vessels of their self-same soul. That's a radically different statement than, treat others as you would like to be treated, is a natural conclusion of how people might treat each other if they deeply understood, not blind faithfully believed, because blind faith belief is easily corrupted by hypocrisy. Dear American Christianity, we're looking at you, kid. But I digress. Most organized religion hits that problematic issue because it gets, if you take a long enough historical view, it is impossible to deny that almost all major world religions were once originally aboriginal, spiritual, tribal practices that were gathered and coalesced by a sort of ideal practitioner who embodied the manifestation of the consequences of those practices fully, i.e., had achieved some sort of state of shifting gears in a metaphysical, quantum mechanical kind of way, i.e., Christ literally says, you all can do what I can do, and what I did was open my third eye and transmute my body into a vessel of light. Enlightenment is not what many of the New Age, especially in America and especially in other places that don't acknowledge the following terminology, anywhere in any context where people are talking about enlightenment, but they do not include the following understanding, then they are lacking in comprehension, either because they've been misguided, they've been taught faulty content, they are blind faithfully attached to manipulative content, etc., etc. All the reasons. There's a full spectrum of reasons, from the most benign, and unfortunately, this happens kind of no fault end of the spectrum, to the full on, they joined a cult that taught them some malarkey. But the statement that I'm stipulating here is the authentic and original meaning of the term enlightenment, which is what Christ talks about in, what is it, Matthew 26, I think? I'm always dubious that I got the right number, because I gave up being a Bible thumper and I threw out all the references from my head so many years ago. But I used to be, until it stopped making sense, because I realized that I couldn't, with integrity, keep thumping the patterns I was encouraged to thump, because my own reading led me to different and intractably at odds conclusions. But Christ not only says you can do what I can do, he says what I can do, and what I'm trying to teach you to do, is to open your third eye and transmute your body so it is made up of light. So, arguably, the 3,000 years of organized Christianity, doesn't matter which label of it, which variety, which club, which bifurcation, which alternative, which variant, it's all been a tug of war between that practice, those practical teachings of spiritual work that whoever it is we are referencing with the title Yeshua Christos, because that was not a name, pin on the corkboard. Go back and dig up what was, for the longest time running, the most popular episode of my show. Any of them, the most popular episodes of my show, where any of them where the word Jesus or Yeshua are in the title, for like 2 years running, that they were consistently, week after week, month after month, the most downloaded episodes. They aren't at the moment, which is interesting. But maybe there's a bunch of new listeners that need to go check them out. I digress. Pins on the corkboard, and I'm sure we'll come full circle. DJ Zed is staring at me like, all right, buddy, this is a lopsided episode, but we need to make sure we clear the list in real time. We played that last one, right? Boom, bye, list. That way we're not worrying about whether or not we played them before. So I digress, I reel it back. What do you get when you create a cultural nexus, a juncture of not understanding and choosing to rely on living through life without ever exercising with this double wielding, this difficult, challenging, muscle building tool of compassion and empathy, which is my own made up analogy for saying choosing to be a I don't give a fuck about other people person, even if you're not technically being any of the, other psychological labels, like an outright narcissist or a full-blown psychopath. But there are plenty of otherwise, quote-unquote, perfectly normal, healthy, stable, balanced people that, and I'm not trying to be rude or, castigate judgment. I'm not pointing a finger and saying bad. I'm saying, hey, where does this path lead us if we allow our entire culture to be this? When it's clear to be a default conditioning, culture of you don't need to extend any fucks. Pardon the F-bomb, right? You don't need to care about others, except for when you choose to. So your caring about others is severely limited to and kept. It is, truncated. No, that's not the word either. Gatekeeping is the right idea, but it's like, it's filtered or, truncated down to your romantic life partner and person you would be maybe making a family with, your immediate family that don't irritate you or piss you off, right? And that's just about it. And the cute puppies and or the sad babies of the world that you want to donate to because of the commercials on TV that get to you. But you're not gonna imagine a society where we openly reject empathy, which seems to be the sneaky slope, slippery slope encroachment that, this collection of diverse content could arguably be accused of engineered, if that's the goal, that's what it was engineered to do, to slowly encroach into people's minds over time, over generations, and cultivate a normalization, a generational normalization of openly choosing to reject the vast majority of situations that call for empathy and compassion towards others. Right? While still being, quote unquote, religious, while still being a quote unquote Christian, while still being a quote unquote spiritual, whatever, hippie, new age, whatever label there works, because this content is coming from all quadrants, okay? It isn't a MAGA Republican Trumptopian sliver of the GOP or demographic, quadrant of the GOP problem. Although they've had their own massively impactful doses of that. It shows up everywhere. This nudge in content that seems to me to be us versus them dehumanizing neurolinguistic programming, encouraging everyone to increasingly prioritize not extending the effort required to connect to others with empathy, which explains the phenomena of denialism in our postmodern culture, right? Denying things that are objectively undeniable because there's too many real world witnesses, because there's measurable metrics that can be independently confirmed. That stems, like, for example, and this meme, we've already talked about this meme back in the heyday of the height of the tug of, ideological public discourse tug of war about the pandemic and its safety protocol issues, of which I was accused by too many of being way deep in the one side, and that I wasn't. I was on my own side going, this is what I agree with and this is what I disagree with, and what I'm concerned about is all the alarmist denialism over there on the extreme side of the don't tread on me conspiratorial continuum of public discourse. I'm not even talking about people, but rather the words being shared out in the full spectrum of all the different range of categories of kinds of points of view being publicly engaged in. It's easy to deny that systemic racism exists if an individual, let's say me or yourself, let's say you and I, dear listener, let's pretend we know each other. We don't. I don't know. You're listening to this podcast in one of the 25 countries around the world that this podcast is listened to. Namaste, hello, and thank you. Please tell your friends about this podcast. I know it's weird. I know it's lumpy and lopsided, and it spirals out of control. I know that it's never quite as short and tight, as succinct as it could be, but it isn't unworthy of finding its audience. So tell your friends, please and thank you. Imagine if you and I, what was my theoretical? It had something to do with, lack of empathy and compassion and refusing to accept other people as humans. Let's imagine if you and I had never witnessed any form of prejudice against women. And we see on the news that in communities other than our own, because in our communities, whatever phenomena of this prejudice is either so quiet, subtle, or well hidden that the vast majority of this little community that we find ourselves in don't notice it, don't talk about it, don't recognize it, don't acknowledge it, so aren't processing it, right? But we see on the news that in other communities other than our own, there are voices advocating against the issue, against prejudice against women. It would be easy for you and I to fall into the denialist trap of saying, well, we've never experienced it. It must be hype. It must be bullshit. It must be false accusation. It must be a politicized gotcha. There's any number of ways to categorically dismiss on anything other than the merits that argument that women over there somewhere are experiencing systemic or individuated anti-female prejudice expressed in words or actions, right? Racism, same thing. It's not helped at all, as exemplified by a recent several days, I think going on multiple weeks long attempt at trolling me, which is hilarious and adorable because it's the umpteenth billionth type of this kind of conversation I've had, and I don't fall for any of it. In fact, I keep saying, this is cute and you're not hurting my feelings, nor am I falling for it. But they're like jerking off to their own tactics, so they're taking themselves for a ride over there. My Instagram, go check out, I think it's the third on the second row, and then the really long conversation. But I don't mean to call that person out, but oh my gosh, it doesn't help that people do this now and they think that they're being clever. But racism, there are people who actually believe that institutional racism is a hoax, that it doesn't really exist, it couldn't possibly exist. Barack Obama was president, yada, yada, yada. I've never seen anyone get mistreated anywhere, yada, yada. But there are, millions of people, women, minorities, etc., along the full spectrum of issues that you could make this example out of, that have experienced both the individual and the institutional bias against them based on whatever category of them that targets them. Okay? It is a capacity that human beings have always had, but that for some reason our pop cultural and seemingly higher density, our pop conspiratorial content has cultivated an increase in this dissociative comfort zone of, I don't really need to ever try to put myself in other people's shoes to understand the world from their perspective. That's a waste of my time and beneath me. And if I don't immediately see the problem others are talking about, they must be bullshitting for nefarious reasons. Because I'm super smart enough to know if something is going on in the world, and if it's not happening in my front yard, it must be a hoax. Especially since my favorite people on my favorite media platforms have suggested as much. Hoaxism, the greatest hoax ever played on humanity, is the hyper-normalization of dismissing anything and everything you don't want to even start to think about as a hoax. And a whole bunch of people who think of themselves, who publicly wave the banner of being self-proclaimed critical thinkers, have fallen into that honeypot of an ego trap. The moment you shield yourself from even having to consider the contents of something as a hoax, without any evidence of it ever having been proven as a hoax. Obviously, there are things that have been proven to be a hoax. Both of Trump's major charitable institutions in New York and New Jersey, right? Isn't that where they were, the two cases? I think there's two. If I'm wrong about those details, I apologize. But right? Those were those were found in two different cases, tried in a court of law. I think, if I'm not mistaken, at least one of the two times under a Republican-appointed judge who may or may not have even been a Trump-appointed judge. Although I'm really fuzzy there, and I don't want to make claims that are wrong, because then I'm, everyone's going to jump all over that and invalidate the entire point that I'm trying to make. When you combine this, and Trump didn't invent this, right? I've said this before, and I'll say it again until it makes sense to people. I'm not trying to blame Trump for having invented the problems that I'm associating with his apparent Trumptopian ideology. He's just a useful, bullheaded puppet that has either knowingly or unknowingly participated in the co-creative, collaborative weaving of a Trumptopian ideology, which includes a lot of problematic elements, which some of which he's never even vocalized. I totally realize, right? Now, I get it. The closest thing to a racist statement that Trump has made, other than really, really, really subtle innuendo-y stuff, which is really easy to dismiss and say that's not racist, and the way he targets certain people, he obviously surrounds himself with minorities so that he can say that he's the least racist person in the room. But that one is a double-edged statement that slices his own, one of his own primary, dangerous, you shouldn't slice open that vein because you'll just bleed out, metaphorically speaking. But this case, not to get into a Trumptopian, not to get all into good GMT territory here, but very little hubbub about it, very little response or acknowledging of the simple reality that it represents. Yet another data point about, but the case against the two African-American mother-daughter team of local election. They were either volunteers or they were local employees of the election committee or whatever they were. Their names totally gone from my mind. I recently just posted a thing about it, and I had their names in my head, but gone. Forgive me. That isn't a lack of respect. It's a thing that my brain does. But he falsely, and I would argue, I have no evidence of this, but based on the broader set of patterns, especially some of the new ones having come to light given vis-a-vis audio tapes where he clearly exposes his own level of self-awareness in a you cannot deny that this is what it actually means that he said that on the tape. And the decades going back, as I've always argued, of his past foibles, he was aware of what he was doing, and his whole game was, I don't know what I'm doing. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But he went out of his way to falsely accuse these two women in the height of the stop the steal, fraudulent, weaponized, fraudulent accusation fervor, which is what he whipped up. He whipped up a fervor of totally irrational, hyper-weaponized, false accusation, machine gun style. It didn't matter how remotely accurate any of it was. It was about overwhelming the opposition with weaponized, false accusations as cranked through one of those oldie-timey machine guns that you got to pull a big, giant crank to spin, and it just goes ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. You know what I'm talking about? But in a cyberpunk, steampunky kind of way where it was 5 of those in a rotating barrel, with 1,000 barrels kind of way. What? Amidst that cornucopia of malarkey slinging, he falsely accused these two ladies of a bunch of nonsense and defamed them. He just lost a case about it, right? They were completely exonerated in exactly the kind of way that Trump has falsely claimed he has been on multiple occasions, because he hasn't. Anyone who read the documentation or reports where he's made that about which he's made those claims would understand that it was a patently false statement. It's what he does. He relies on his, lack of apathy. So he has helped and refine this decades and potentially generations old ongoing effort to cultivate a hyper normalization of a weaponized lack of empathy and compassion for others. And combined with the weaponization of dehumanizing false accusational, like, barrage attack techniques like the one I was just describing, if that marinates long enough without being called out for what it is and exposed as a form of obvious psychological manipulation for the purposes of manipulating large groups of people to ignore reality and take weaponized and increasingly made violent political action, right? Politicized violence, increasingly politicized violent actions, which is categorically un-American, according to the best, most moderate and holistic and all-inclusive interpretation of this grand experiment we're all trying to abide in. And it alarms me, folks. It is of great importance to me that we help each other pause and zoom way back to take stock of this. Because whilst it can be interesting and fun and informative and useful and empowering and important and even entertaining to go down certain rabbit holes or get lost in the weeds or dive into the deep end of certain diving tanks of specificity, for example, the way some might accuse me of doing with Good Morning Trumptopia, the special segment of the Almost Daily Zencast, which you can find by searching hashtag GMT in the same platform that you get your copy of this podcast show. Let me know if you see it yet, etc. But I digress. Combined, you create and this is why this is such an alarming thing. When you combine those two tools successfully, which is what I'm calling out, it seems to be one of the many things that are actually going on in our world around us today, as opposed to any of the things that aren't really, but people believe in because the content is being shared as a distractionary measure. And often, my argument postulates that content is riddled not only with distractionary neurolinguistic stuff, but with the kind of programming that is exactly explicitly about this, about cultivating a willingness to withhold empathy and compassion based on the rationalization that either some specifically targeted group of others or the broad spectrum of those who are unknown as a group of others. In other words, anybody and everybody. If you're not with us, you're against us. So that those people can be radically psychologically, intellectually deleted, right? Think about it rationally from a broad spectrum, backed up, big picture point of view. If a group of people, if a large enough population of people bonded together by a common identity-based ideological platform or set of platforms, like whatever you call that, a party platform plank, a plank of platforms or a platform of planks, are convinced, if this group of people are convinced to not only be outraged and frustrated and vexed and enraged, and, you know, angered, but also be psychologically and intellectually convinced of the irrational conclusion that those who are supposedly responsible and to be held to account for anything and everything that perturbs them are inherently unworthy of being thought of or treated with the same kind of respect that we are asked to offer others in the Golden Rule, right? Oh, they don't qualify for the Golden Rule because of X, Y, and Z. They're not worthy of being treated the way I would like to be treated because they are evil, Satan-worshipping robots from Mars, from a proximal timeline where Martian robots eat babies to stay young. Whatever it is, whatever atrocious sounding absurdity it might be, and the most dangerous ones are the ones that are most plausible and most believable, only slightly more so than the ones that are most implausible and unbelievable, right? Because the ones that are most crazy unbelievable have a more chaotic probability of flash in the pan instigation of unprompted action. Like, if you get an individual or a group of individuals to believe in the most unbelievable thing with some connection back to reality that it's all them over there, they are the giant living robots, machines from whatever, you know, they are the trans-dimensional demonic brain eaters that are trying to invade our planet, disguised as human beings pretending to be a sane, rational political party. The moment you get to that level of belief, and that belief is cemented in blind faith, and that belief is cemented directly to one's own ego construct with that blind faith, it's you know, it becomes, unfortunately, all too easy to condone and or support and or convince oneself that it is time to conduct or commit egregious acts against those others in direct hypocritical violation of one's own religious supposed beliefs. Because, quite humorously, all religions claim that they're about establishing order, creating peace here on earth. So I digress. It's the thing that must be looked out for. And it's why I always stop when I see something and speak out about it, right? Like, obviously I didn't ramble this long because I've gone over an hour, or about to go over an hour. I've already gone over an hour by 4 minutes at the gas station, but I did way more concisely say, precisely, it is empathy and or the lack thereof about which, it is truly where the struggle is. It is because of the lack of empathy that people cannot imagine the horrors that others are literally experiencing and therefore refuse to help and or fight against. So one must always question content, ideology, dogma, political, religious, or otherwise, that insinuates and or plants the seeds of apathy, of judgment, of dismissive, non-inclusive otherification, of any of the steps on the slippery slope towards demonization, vilification, dehumanization of the targeted other, whether specific or generic. And that's what I got to say about that, friends, because that's how we got here. It is through the use of those tools already over the last 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, that the human species has dragged itself into the crazy, chaotic, post-nuclear, pre-dystopian cornucopia of crazy that is our everyday, quote-unquote, normal life in this particular moment, as we see it. And we're never going to solve the problems by trying to troll each other. Dear trolls, why do you take up and utilize the tools of the puppet masters? Why do you choose to engage in supercilious, extremely non-serious, and intellectually pointless activity that only buzzes your, self-superiority ego buzz and doesn't actually contribute towards the solution of any of the effing problems that we face? Because I assure you, anyone who genuinely sets aside those bags, authentically puts on the really difficult and uncomfortable critical thinker's hat and critical thinker's glasses, because it's a combined set of tools, allegorically speaking, and really starts to engage in deep critical thinking and questioning of everything, it becomes really, 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 really clear in a very difficult to overthrow, debunk, or deny kind of way that we will never solve any of our problems by perpetuating the current status quo and pushing things in the current direction that we're pushing things. And it doesn't even matter the sources of these impetus, because the solution isn't proving that it's this group or that group or the robots from Mars or the lizard people from, the Umbra dimension. The further afield from measurable and provable it is, the less relevant it becomes, because ultimately what matters is the intradimensional, spiritual, psychokinetic healing that will spark our ability, that will support and shore up our ability as individuals and as a collective of community collectives to choose empathy and compassion over ideological, dogmatic, us versus them, dehumanizing argumentation. To choose to heal as a means by which to find the solution. And to solve things through healing. And that's what I got to say about that, folks. As always, thank you for tuning in, and namaste.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily Zencast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zappa. Until next time, may peace, love and grooviness blossom in your heart.
I'm laughing at myself because I always say, and that's what I got to say about that. And I always forget that that's exactly the next thing I say on the outro recording. And I feel like a schmuck every time. But I also sort of love it because it's hilarious.